At 0730 hours on 19th May 1942, Lieutenant General William Joseph Slim stood beside a dirt road on the Imphal Plain in northeastern India and watched what remained of his Burma Corps stagger across the frontier. They came in small groups. Platoons that had begun the campaign as 40 men now numbered 8 or 12. Companies that should have counted 120 were down to 30. The men were gaunt. They were filthy. They were ravaged by malaria and dysentery. Their uniforms hung in rags. Many had no boots. They had marched 900 miles. They had fought for 140 days. They had lost 13,000 men killed, wounded, or missing out of 42,000. They had abandoned 122 field guns. They had destroyed hundreds of vehicles. They still carried their weapons. They still maintained their formations. They looked like scarecrows, but they moved like soldiers. Slim knew what they had accomplished. This was the longest fighting retreat in British military history. It was also the most complete disaster. Japan now controlled all of Burma. The road to China was cut. The eastern frontier of India lay exposed. The men stumbling past Slim had lost everything except their discipline and their lives. They did not expect to be greeted as heroes. They expected to be met as soldiers who had been defeated but not disgraced. That is not what happened. India was unprepared for the flood of exhausted troops and terrified refugees. There were no medical facilities. There were no rest camps. There were no hot meals or clean beds or sympathetic officers explaining what would happen next. The men who had fought for 5 months were told to make do. Slim was furious. His soldiers had earned better. They would not receive it. This failure of basic military administration would shape everything Slim did for the next 3 years. He was 51 years old. He was burly and gray and going bald. He had a blunt face and a direct manner. He wore a battered slouch hat that Gurkha regiments wore and that would become the symbol of the army he would build. He was not well known outside the insular circles of the Indian Army. He had no powerful connections in London. He had attended no prestigious schools. His father was a metal worker in Bristol. His first job after leaving school was as an elementary teacher in a Birmingham slum. He had worked as a junior clerk. He had obtained a temporary commission in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment in August 1914 through sheer determination and had nearly died at Gallipoli and in Mesopotamia. He had clawed his way into a permanent commission in the Indian Army in 1918 because he had no other prospects. His career between the wars had been slow. His promotion to lieutenant colonel had come in 1938, 24 years after he first put on a uniform. He was utterly unsuited for high command by the standards of the British officer class. He was also about to demonstrate that he was one of the finest operational commanders of the Second World War. The disaster had begun on 8th of December 1941 when Japanese aircraft bombed Rangoon. The Imperial Japanese Army invaded Burma from Thailand in January 1942 with 2 divisions. They were experienced. They were well-trained. They were aggressive. They had perfected jungle tactics in China and Malaya. They understood infiltration and encirclement. They moved quickly through terrain the British considered impassable. They attacked at night. They used the jungle. They cut supply lines and appeared where they were not expected. The British Burma Army was not prepared for any of this. The Burma Army consisted primarily of Indian units with British officers. Many battalions were newly raised. Training was incomplete. Equipment was inadequate. There was no air support. The Royal Air Force had a handful of obsolete fighters. The Japanese had air superiority from the first day. The British command structure was chaotic. Administrative control bounced between India, Singapore, and London. Operational control changed hands repeatedly. No one was clear who was responsible for what. The War Office in London assumed Burma could defend itself. The commanders in India assumed someone else was handling Burma. The government of Burma had minimal military resources and no authority. When the Japanese attacked, the entire defensive structure collapsed. Lieutenant General Thomas Hutton commanded the Burma Army when the campaign began. He was competent but overwhelmed. The Japanese captured Moulmein on 31 January 1942. They advanced rapidly toward Rangoon. Hutton ordered a defensive stand at the Sitang River. On 22 February, the Japanese reached the vital bridge before most of the British forces could cross. The commanding officer faced an impossible choice. If he did not blow the bridge, the Japanese would capture it intact and use it to pursue. If he blew the bridge with his own troops still on the wrong side, those troops would be lost. He blew the bridge. 2 brigades were trapped on the east bank. 700 men made it across. 5,000 were killed, captured. or scattered into the jungle. Rangoon fell on 7 March 1942. The capital was gone. The port was gone. The supply base was gone. The Burma road to China was cut. General Harold Alexander arrived to take overall command. He immediately recognized he needed a corps commander to fight the battle while he handled political and strategic matters. Someone recommended Slim. Alexander had never heard of him. London was also considering Slim because Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Archibald Nye, had noted his ability at Staff College, Camberley years earlier. Slim got the job by bureaucratic accident. He arrived in Rangoon just as the city was being evacuated. On 19th March 1942, Slim took command of Burma Corps, known as Burr Corps. It consisted of the 17th Indian Division and the 1st Burma Division. Total strength was approximately 42,000 men. The Chinese were also in Burma with several divisions, but command arrangements were confused and cooperation was minimal. The Japanese now had 4 divisions in Burma and controlled the skies. Slim's mission was simple and impossible. Delay the Japanese or preserve the army. Retreat to India. Do not allow the retreat to become a rout. The retreat began immediately. The distance from Rangoon to the Indian frontier at Imphal was approximately 900 miles. The terrain was brutal. Dense jungle, steep mountains, narrow tracks, rivers with few bridges. The monsoon was approaching. Once it began, movement would become nearly impossible. The Japanese pursued relentlessly. They had captured British supplies in Rangoon and were living off captured stocks. They moved faster than the British because they traveled light and used bicycles and captured vehicles. They infiltrated through the jungle and set up roadblocks behind British positions. Every time Slim established a defensive line, the Japanese appeared in his rear. The only advantage Slim possessed was that Japanese logistics were stretched thin. The farther north they advanced, the longer their supply lines became. Their offensive began to slow, not because Slim stopped them, but because they outran their supplies. This gave Slim time to organize. He established rear guards. He coordinated movements. He ensured units did not panic. He kept formations together. He made certain wounded men were carried and equipment was destroyed rather than abandoned. He kept the army functioning as an army rather than disintegrating into a mob of refugees. The Chinese troops were also retreating, but command coordination was minimal. American General Joseph Stilwell was nominally in command of Chinese forces, but had little actual control. Stilwell later wrote that Slim had conducted the retreat brilliantly and was the real hero. The BBC announced that Alexander had handled the withdrawal with skill and resourcefulness. Alexander received the credit. Slim received the blame for the defeat. This pattern would repeat throughout the war. Slim's subordinates and soldiers revered him. His superiors in London and Delhi dismissed him as second-rate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill formed a negative opinion of Slim without ever meeting him. By May 1942, the monsoon was about to break. Slim reached Imphal with the remnants of his corps just as torrential rain began. His men collapsed in the mud. They had no shelter. They had minimal supplies. They had no transport. They were sick. They were exhausted. Many were dying from disease. The medical facilities in India were overwhelmed. The civilian administration was unprepared. Slim's men had saved themselves by reaching India, but India was not ready to receive them. Slim spent the summer of 1942 recovering from illness and reassessing what had gone wrong. He identified multiple failures. British commanders had underestimated Japanese capabilities. British doctrine was rigid. British tactics were predictable. British soldiers believed the jungle was impassable. Japanese soldiers had proven them wrong. The Japanese moved through terrain the British avoided. They fought at night when British soldiers expected rest. They used infiltration when British doctrine called for frontal assault. They were willing to take risks. British commanders were not. Slim concluded that the fundamental problem was psychological. British and Indian troops believed they could not beat the Japanese in the jungle. This belief was self-fulfilling until morale was restored. No amount of training or equipment would matter. Slim needed to prove to his soldiers that the Japanese were not invincible. He needed to give them a victory. He needed to rebuild their confidence from nothing. In September 1942, Eastern Army Commander General Noel Irwin ordered an offensive into the Arakan region of western Burma. The objective was to recapture the port of Akab. Slim was given command of 15th Corps, which would conduct the operation. Slim advised against the offensive. His corps was not ready. Training was incomplete. Supply arrangements were inadequate. The terrain was terrible. Irwin ignored the advice. The operation went ahead. It was a disaster. Japanese forces counterattacked in March 1943 using the same infiltration tactics they had perfected. They cut British supply lines. They encircled British units. The offensive collapsed. Irwin blamed Slim. Slim had been given tactical control too late to salvage the situation, but received the blame anyway. The pattern repeated. Someone else made the decisions. Slim took the responsibility. But this time the outcome was different. Irwin was sacked. Slim was promoted. In October 1943, Slim was appointed commander of the newly formed 14th Army. This was the force that would reconquer Burma. It consisted of multiple corps drawn from across the British Empire. British divisions, Indian divisions, East African divisions, West African divisions, Gurkha brigades. The force was multinational and multi-ethnic and had been beaten repeatedly by the Japanese. Morale was terrible. Training was inadequate. Equipment was worn out. Supply lines were stretched to breaking. Air support was minimal. The soldiers called themselves the Forgotten Army because everyone had forgotten they existed. The press ignored them. The politicians ignored them. The supplies went to Europe. Slim faced a monumental task. He needed to transform a defeated army into a fighting force capable of offensive operations. He needed to do this with minimal resources in the worst terrain and climate in the world. He needed to convince his soldiers that they could win. He had approximately 1 year before the next Japanese offensive. He began with morale. Slim personally visited every unit in his army. He stood on ammunition boxes and addressed the men directly. He wore his battered slouch hat and spoke in plain language. He told them to take a good look at his face so they would recognize him when he came around and could say the old bastard was visiting. He did not promise easy victories. He did not deliver patriotic speeches. He told them the truth. The Japanese were good soldiers. The jungle was brutal. The monsoon was coming. Supply would be difficult. Casualties would be heavy. But the job could be done if everyone did their part. The soldiers responded to his honesty. Slim was not like other generals. He did not hide behind staff officers. He did not travel in motorcades. He walked among the men. He talked with junior officers and enlisted soldiers. He asked about their problems. He listened to complaints. He fixed what could be fixed. When he could not fix something, he explained why and what he was doing to work around it. The men trusted him. They knew he cared about their welfare. They knew he would not waste their lives. Slim also implemented practical reforms. He emphasized jungle training. British soldiers needed to learn that the jungle was not the enemy. It was terrain like any other terrain. It could be used. It could be traversed. Japanese soldiers used the jungle effectively because they trained in it. British soldiers would do the same. Every unit conducted extensive jungle exercises. They learned to move quietly. They learned to navigate by compass. They learned to live in the jungle for days or weeks. They stopped fearing it. Slim also revolutionized supply doctrine. Traditional military logistics required continuous landlines of communication. Supplies moved by road or rail from rear depots to forward units. If those lines were cut, forward units starved. Japanese infiltration tactics specifically targeted supply lines. Once a unit was encircled, it either fought its way out or surrendered. Slim rejected this doctrine entirely. He would supply his army by air. Air supply was not new. The RAF had conducted limited air supply operations in the 1930s, but Slim planned to supply entire divisions by air for extended periods. This required unprecedented coordination between ground and air forces. It required massive transport aircraft capacity. It required secure airfields close to the front. It required detailed planning and flawless execution. Slim developed the doctrine. He trained his units. He coordinated with the RAF and United States Army Air Forces. He made it work. The new doctrine changed everything. A surrounded unit was no longer doomed. It could dig in and be supplied by air indefinitely. This eliminated the psychological advantage Japanese infiltration provided. British units stopped retreating when their supply lines were cut. They formed defensive boxes and called for air supply. The boxes were supplied. The Japanese attacks failed. The tide began to turn. Slim also developed aggressive tactics adapted to jungle warfare. He trained his units to infiltrate just as the Japanese did. He emphasized patrolling and reconnaissance. He taught officers to think independently and seize opportunities. He decentralized command. He told subordinates what to achieve and why, not what to do and how. He trusted his divisional and brigade commanders to execute missions without constant supervision. This was revolutionary in the British Army, where centralized control was standard doctrine. The test came in March 1944. Japanese Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi launched Operation U-Go, the invasion of India. 3 Japanese divisions crossed the Chindwin River and advanced toward the British supply bases at Imphal and Kohima. Mutaguchi's plan was bold. His forces would move rapidly, cut British supply lines, capture the supply dumps at Imphal, and drive into India. British forces would collapse just as they had in 1942. The plan failed because Slim had transformed the 14th Army. At Imphal, IV Corps was surrounded. Under the old doctrine, the Corps would have attempted to retreat. Under Slim's doctrine, the Corps held its positions and was supplied by air. RAF and USAF transport aircraft flew in supplies and flew out wounded. Day and night, rain or shine. The monsoon began and the flights continued. Japanese attacks were repulsed. The defensive boxes held. The Japanese had expected the British to panic. The British did not panic. 60 miles north at Kohima, a small garrison of 2,500 men was surrounded by 15,000 Japanese troops. The garrison occupied Kohima Ridge. The fighting was savage. Hand-to-hand combat in the ruins of the deputy commissioner's bungalow. Fighting for the tennis court where the distance between opposing positions was measured in yards. The defenders were running out of water. They were running out of ammunition. They were nearly starving. But they held. Reinforcements arrived on 18th April. British Fourteenth Corps under Lieutenant General Montague Stopford fought through Japanese roadblocks and broke through. The siege was relieved. The battles at Imphal and Kohima raged for 3 months. The Japanese threw everything they had at the British positions. They attacked repeatedly. They suffered appalling casualties. By June, the offensive had collapsed. Mutaguchi called off the operation on 3rd July 1944. The Japanese 15th Army had suffered 53,000 casualties out of 85,000 men. Most died from starvation and disease during the retreat. The British and Indian forces suffered 16,500 casualties. It was the greatest defeat the Japanese army had ever suffered on land. Slim did not allow his enemy to recover. On 2 December 1944, the Viceroy of India, Field Marshal Archibald Wavell, arrived at Imphal. In front of formations of Scottish, Gurkha, and Punjabi regiments, Wavell knighted Slim and 3 of his corps commanders. Lieutenant General William Slim became Lieutenant General Sir William Slim. The ceremony was brief. Slim had no time for pageantry. The 14th Army was advancing. The plan for 1945 was Slim's masterpiece. The objective was to destroy Japanese forces in central Burma and recapture Rangoon before the monsoon. This required crossing the Irrawaddy River, the largest river in Burma. While it was defended by determined Japanese forces, it required moving 2 corps across hundreds of miles of jungle and mountains. It required maintaining supply lines that stretched to the limit of what air transport could support. It required speed and deception and flawless coordination. Slim planned it all. The deception was critical. Japanese General Hayataro Kimura commanded Burma Area Army. He expected the main British thrust to come toward Mandalay, the historic capital and a major road and rail junction. Slim would give him what he expected, but not where he expected it. XY3 Corps under Stopford would advance openly toward Mandalay from the north. This was the feint. The real attack would come from IV Corps under Lieutenant General Frank Messervy, advancing from the west toward Meiktila, 90 miles south of Mandalay. Meiktila was the key. All Japanese supplies moving north from Rangoon passed through Meiktila. The road network converged there. The rail line terminated there. Supply dumps were concentrated there. Airfields were there. If Meiktila fell, Japanese forces defending Mandalay would be cut off. They would have to abandon their positions or starve. Kimura would be forced to counterattack Meiktila with everything he had. The British would be ready. Mandalay would be the hammer. Meiktila would be the anvil. Japanese forces would be crushed between them. The execution required extraordinary logistics. IV Corps had to move 300 miles from the left flank of the British Army to the right flank. This movement had to be concealed from Japanese reconnaissance. Units were transferred from IV Corps to X-Tweedorf Corps, so Japanese intelligence would think IV Corps was not moving. Dummy headquarters were established with signals traffic to maintain the deception. Irregular forces were deployed in front of IV Corps because the British had typically used irregulars only in rear areas, not on main fronts. IV Corps moved down the Ganga Valley west of the Chindwin River. The valley had no roads. Engineers built the road as the Corps advanced. They constructed 541 boats and barges to move supplies down the Chindwin to the Irrawaddy. The movement was complete by January 1945. The Japanese suspected nothing. On 14th of January 1945, 19th Indian Division of Xwitdul Corps crossed the Irrawaddy north of Mandalay at narrow points near Thabakian and Kyaukmiaung. The crossings were opposed. The fighting was bitter. The Japanese counterattacked repeatedly. The bridges held. More British forces crossed Kimura was convinced this was the main British effort. He reinforced the Mandalay front with units from the north and south. He committed his reserves. The deception worked. On 13th February 1945, 7th Indian Division of IV Corps crossed the Irrawaddy near Nyangu, 40 miles southwest of Mandalay. The crossing was nearly unopposed. The Japanese had minimal forces in the area. The division secured a bridgehead. On 14th February, 20th Indian Division of Xwitdul Corps crossed 20 miles west of Mandalay. On 17th of February, the motorized 17th Indian Division began crossing at Nyangu. On 19th of February, the 255th Indian Tank Brigade began crossing. The race to Meiktila was on. The 17th Division was commanded by Major General David Tennant Cowan. The division's infantry brigades were fully motorized. They traveled in trucks. They could move quickly across open terrain. The 255th Tank Brigade was equipped with M4 Sherman medium tanks, American-built, reliable, well-armed. The tanks and trucks together formed a mechanized column capable of rapid exploitation. This was armored warfare adapted to Burma. It would prove devastating. The column broke out of the Nyangu bridgehead on 20 February and raced east. The objective was Tongtha, halfway to Meiktila. The column reached Tongtha on 24 February. The Japanese were stunned. They had not expected British forces to move so quickly across terrain they considered impassable for armor. A staff meeting was being held at Meiktila on 23 February to discuss the situation at Mandalay. Nobody was concerned about the south. Reports placed British forces 40 miles away at Tongtha, but the reports were dismissed as describing a minor raid. One report stated 200 enemy vehicles had been spotted. The actual number was 2,000. Someone had dropped a zero. The error was fatal. The column advanced from Tongtha on 26 February. The objective was Thabutkan Airfield, 20 miles from Meiktila. The airfield was captured on 28 February. Transport aircraft began landing supplies immediately. The column was now within striking distance of Meiktila itself. Cowan had 63 hours from breakout to the capture of the airfield. This was blitzkrieg warfare in the jungle. The attack on Meiktila began on 1 March 1945. The 255th Tank Brigade led. Sherman tanks smashed through Japanese defenses. Infantry followed in trucks and on foot. The fighting was intense. The Japanese garrison numbered approximately 4,000 troops. Many were administrative and support personnel, but they fought hard. The Japanese used suicide bombers. Soldiers with explosives strapped to their bodies threw themselves under tanks. Some succeeded. Most were shot before they could detonate. The tank crews learned quickly. They kept their machine guns firing constantly. Nothing approached the tanks. By 3 March, Meiktila was in British hands. The Japanese supply base was captured. Ammunition dumps, fuel stores, food stocks, all taken intact. The roads and railways converging on the town were cut. Japanese forces defending Mandalay were isolated. Slim flew into Meiktila in an American general's aircraft on 4 March. The RAF had refused to fly him, citing safety concerns. He observed the battle from the air and walked through the ruined town. He noted that it had all been very businesslike. Kimura now faced catastrophe. His forces at Mandalay were cut off. His logistics were severed. He had to recapture Meiktila immediately or lose central Burma. He ordered a counteroffensive. The Japanese 18th Division and 49th Division were redirected from other fronts. The 15th Army committed most of its artillery and its remaining armor. 14th Tank Regiment. Japanese forces surrounded Meiktila and attacked from all directions. The siege began on 10th March. Cowan had anticipated this. The 17th Division and 255th Tank Brigade dug in. Defensive positions were prepared. Supplies were stockpiled. Air supply was arranged. The RAF flew in reinforcements and supplies daily. The Japanese attacked repeatedly. They suffered heavy casualties. The British had tanks and air support. The Japanese had determination and infantry. It was not enough. The siege lasted 3 weeks. The Japanese lost 2,500 men. They lost 50 artillery pieces. They had only 20 guns remaining. The attacks failed. At Mandalay, Xwitdul Corps was advancing from the north and west. The 19th Division broke out of its bridgehead and drove south. The 20th Division attacked southward from its bridgehead. The British 2nd Division attacked Mandalay from the west. Japanese forces defending the city fought fiercely. They occupied Fort Dufferin, the old British citadel with walls 30 feet high and 20 feet thick. Artillery could not breach the walls. Bombing was ineffective. The defenders held the maze of pagodas and buildings in the city. Urban combat was brutal. The 4th Battalion, 4th Gurkha Rifles, advanced up Mandalay Hill on either march. They fought from temple to temple. The Japanese used tunnels and bunkers. Progress was slow. The hill fell after several days of close combat. Fort Dufferin held until 20 March. The Japanese abandoned the position rather than be trapped. Mandalay was in British hands. The symbolic value was enormous. The old royal capital had fallen. The Burmese population turned against the Japanese. Uprisings began across the country. Guerrilla forces attacked Japanese supply lines. The Burma National Army, which the Japanese had raised and trained, mutinied and joined the British. The Japanese position in Burma collapsed. Between Mandalay and Meiktila, Japanese forces were trapped and destroyed. By 28 March, Lieutenant General Shinichi Tanaka, Kimura's chief of staff, ordered all Japanese forces to break off attacks on Meiktila and retreat south. It was too late. The Japanese armies in central Burma had lost their equipment and cohesion. They had suffered approximately 30,000 killed. They had lost hundreds of artillery pieces and vehicles. They retreated in disorder toward Rangoon. Slim did not give them time to reorganize. The 14th Army pursued relentlessly. The advance south toward Rangoon became a race against the monsoon. If the rains began before Rangoon fell, the advance would bog down in mud. Supplies would be cut off. The campaign would stall. Slim needed to reach Rangoon by early May. IV Corps led the advance. They covered 300 miles in 6 weeks. Supply lines stretched to breaking point. Transport aircraft flew constantly. Engineers repaired roads and bridges as the army advanced. Japanese resistance was sporadic. The retreat had become a rout. On 1st May, British airborne and seaborne forces captured Rangoon. IV Corps arrived 2 days later. The campaign was over. Burma was liberated. The 14th Army had destroyed Japanese forces in Burma. Estimated Japanese casualties for the entire Burma campaign exceeded 100,000 killed. British and Commonwealth casualties were approximately 70,000 killed, wounded, and missing across all campaigns from 1942 to 1945. The greatest land defeat Japan suffered in World War II had been inflicted by an army that everyone had forgotten existed. The cost had been extraordinary. The 14th Army fought continuously for 3 years in the worst conditions imaginable: the jungle, the heat, the monsoon. Malaria and dysentery killed as many men as combat. Supply was a constant crisis. Reinforcements arrived slowly. Equipment wore out faster than it could be replaced. The men endured because Slim led them. He visited the front constantly. He talked with soldiers. He understood their problems. He did everything possible to improve their welfare. The men knew he cared. They trusted him. They followed him. In May 1945, as the Burma campaign was ending, Slim received orders from General Oliver Leese, commander of Allied Land Forces Southeast Asia. Slim would not command the 14th Army in the planned invasion of Malaya. He would instead command the newly formed 12th Army, which would remain in Burma to mop up. Slim refused. He said he would prefer to retire. The news spread through the 14th Army immediately. The reaction was fury. The men had fought for 3 years under Slim's command. They had won the greatest victories in the Burma campaign. Now Slim was being sidelined for the final operation. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, was furious that he had not been consulted. Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief India, was furious. Supreme Allied Commander Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten was forced to intervene. He ordered Leese to reverse the decision. On 1st July 1945, Slim was promoted to full general and appointed Commander-in-Chief Allied Land Forces Southeast Asia. Replacing Leese, justice was served, but the insult remained. After the war ended, Slim returned to Britain. His reception was lukewarm. Field marshals Harold Alexander and Bernard Montgomery were the heroes of the hour. Books appeared about Mountbatten. Books appeared about Ord Wingate and his Chindits. Books appeared about Stilwell. Slim received footnotes. He had commanded the largest British army of the war. He had won the greatest British victories against Japan. He had transformed a defeated force into a supremely effective fighting machine. Nobody seemed to notice. Slim became Commandant of the Imperial Defense College in 1946. In 1948, he was brought out of retirement and appointed Chief of the Imperial General Staff with the rank of Field Marshal. He served until 1952. He was then appointed Governor-General of Australia, serving until 1960. He published his memoir, Defeat into Victory. In 1956, the book became a classic of military history. It is one of the finest first-hand accounts of command ever written. Slim wrote with honesty and humility. He did not glorify himself. He acknowledged mistakes. He gave credit to subordinates. He explained his thinking clearly and directly. In 2011, the National Army Museum conducted a poll asking the British public to identify Britain's greatest general. Slim tied with the Duke of Wellington for first place. In 2013, the battles of Imphal and Kohima were voted Britain's greatest battle, ahead of Waterloo, Trafalgar, and D-Day. Recognition came slowly, but it came. Historians recognized what contemporary officials had missed. Slim was one of the finest commanders of World War II. His greatness lay in understanding people. He understood soldiers. He knew what they needed. He knew what they could endure. He knew how to motivate them. He did not rely on patriotic rhetoric or appeals to duty. He spoke plainly. He told the truth. He delivered on his promises. He never asked his men to do anything he would not do himself. He cared about their welfare genuinely and acted on that concern consistently. The soldiers recognized this immediately. They trusted him because he earned their trust. Slim also understood operational art at a level few commanders achieved. He grasped the relationship between strategy, operations, and tactics. He understood logistics. He knew that campaigns are won or lost based on supply. He revolutionized air supply doctrine because he recognized that traditional logistics could not support offensive operations in Burma. He decentralized command because he understood that junior officers needed freedom to seize opportunities. He trained his army to fight in the jungle because he recognized that fear of terrain was a psychological problem that training could solve. His handling of the Imphal and Kohima battles demonstrated defensive mastery. He allowed his forces to be surrounded because he knew they could be supplied by air. He turned Japanese infiltration tactics into a trap. The Japanese expected British forces to retreat. British forces held their positions and became anchors around which Japanese attacks broke. The defensive boxes worked because Slim had prepared his army for exactly this situation. Training, doctrine, supply, morale. Everything had been developed specifically to counter Japanese tactics. When the test came, the system worked perfectly. His handling of the Meiktila and Mandalay campaign demonstrated offensive genius. The deception was flawless. The logistics were extraordinary. The execution was rapid and aggressive. He used armor and terrain everyone said was unsuitable for tanks. He moved corpse-sized forces 300 miles across mountains and jungle while maintaining secrecy. He identified the enemy's center of gravity at Meiktila and struck it with overwhelming force at the decisive moment. The Japanese had no time to respond. The entire Japanese defensive structure in central Burma collapsed within 6 weeks. Slim understood his enemy. He fought the Japanese continuously from March 1942 to May 1945. He studied their tactics. He learned their strengths and weaknesses. He knew they would infiltrate. He knew they would attack at night. He knew they would fight to the death. He trained his army to counter Japanese tactics and exploit Japanese weaknesses. The Japanese relied on aggression and mobility. Slim denied them both by holding defensive positions supplied by air. The Japanese expected British forces to panic when surrounded. British forces did not panic. The psychological advantage the Japanese had enjoyed since 1941 disappeared. Slim also understood combined arms warfare. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air power were integrated seamlessly. Tank-infantry cooperation in the drive to Meiktila was superb. Artillery support at Imphal and Kohima was effective and responsive. Air power was decisive. Fighter bombers and medium bombers attacked Japanese positions. Supply dumps and lines of communication constantly. Transport aircraft delivered thousands of tons of supplies and evacuated thousands of wounded. Close air support was coordinated efficiently. The RAF and USAF worked together effectively. This level of joint operations was rare in any theater of World War II. The 14th Army was also a genuinely multinational force. British divisions, Indian divisions, East African divisions, West African divisions, Gurkha brigades, Chinese units, American liaison teams, Burmese irregular forces. Slim commanded them all and maintained cohesion. Different languages, different cultures, different religions, different military traditions. Slim treated everyone with respect. He recognized contributions from all units. He never played favorites. The army functioned as a unified force because Slim made it function. This was leadership and diplomacy operating simultaneously. The Burma campaign was also a war against disease. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, and other tropical diseases hospitalized men faster than combat. The 14th Army developed comprehensive medical protocols. Anti-malarial drugs were distributed systematically. Water discipline was enforced rigorously. Field hospitals were established close to the front. Evacuation procedures were efficient. The sick and wounded were treated quickly and returned to duty when possible. Slim paid personal attention to medical matters because he understood that an army that could not stay healthy could not fight. The campaign was also a war of logistics. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every ration had to be transported hundreds of miles through jungle and over mountains. Roads were primitive or non-existent. Rail lines ended far from the front. Rivers were the only reliable transport routes in many areas. Engineers built roads, bridges, and airfields constantly. Supply officers coordinated movements of thousands of tons of material daily. Transport aircraft flew around the clock. The logistics system worked because Slim insisted it work. He understood that battles are won by supply officers as much as combat soldiers. The Burma campaign demonstrated what properly led and trained forces can accomplish under the worst possible conditions. The 14th Army fought in terrain and climate that everyone agreed were the worst in the world. They fought an enemy who had defeated them repeatedly. They fought with minimal resources while other theaters received priority. They fought for 3 years with limited recognition and no glory. They won because Slim transformed them from a defeated rabble into a professional fighting force that could match and surpass the best the Japanese army could field. Slim's legacy is found in modern military doctrine. His emphasis on junior officer initiative influenced British and American thinking about mission command. His development of air supply operations became standard practice in later conflicts. His understanding of morale and leadership became the foundation for modern approaches to troop welfare. His integration of combined arms operations set standards that remain relevant. His operational planning, particularly the Meiktila operation, is studied in staff colleges worldwide as an example of operational art executed brilliantly. The men who served under Slim never forgot him. They called him Uncle Bill. The nickname was affectionate and respectful. He was the soldiers' general. He understood them. He cared for them. He led them to victory. When he died on 14th of December 1970, the entire 14th Army mourned. Veterans associations held memorial services. Letters poured in from former soldiers who remembered the general who had walked among them and listened to their problems. Field Marshal Slim was buried at St. Mark's Church in Kennington. The funeral was attended by royalty and government officials and retired generals. But the real tribute came from the men who had fought in Burma. They lined the streets. They saluted the coffin. They wept for the commander who had never forgotten them. The memorial at Kohima bears an inscription that has become famous. It reads, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, 'For your tomorrow, we gave our today.'" The words commemorate the men who died holding Kohima Ridge in April 1944. They also commemorate everyone who fought in Burma. The Forgotten Army, the men who fought in the jungle while the world looked elsewhere. The men who won the greatest British victories of the war against Japan. The men who followed Slim. The battles they fought are remembered now. Imphal and Kohima, Meiktila and Mandalay. The longest retreat, the greatest defeat Japan suffered on land. The transformation of a defeated army into a victorious one. The campaigns are studied. The tactics are analyzed. The logistics are examined. The leadership is recognized as exceptional. Slim's approach to command was fundamentally different from his contemporaries. Montgomery was methodical and cautious. Patton was aggressive and flamboyant. MacArthur was theatrical and political. Slim was direct and pragmatic. He focused on solving problems rather than cultivating an image. He cared about results, not recognition. He understood that soldiers respond to honesty and competence, not theatrics. His leadership style was built on mutual respect and shared sacrifice. He asked nothing of his men that he would not do himself. He shared their hardships. He understood their fears. He addressed their concerns. They followed him because he earned their loyalty every single day. The contrast with other theaters is striking. In Europe, Allied armies advanced with overwhelming material superiority. In the Pacific, American forces had naval and air superiority from mid-1942 onward. In Burma, the 14th Army fought with minimal support and maximal difficulty. Resources were scarce, climate was brutal, terrain was nightmarish. The enemy was experienced and determined. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Slim won anyway. He won because he understood that battles are won by soldiers, not by equipment. He made certain his soldiers were trained, supplied, led, and motivated. Everything else followed from that foundation. The transformation he accomplished was extraordinary. In May 1942, the Burma Army was a defeated rabble retreating toward India. By June 1944, the 14th Army had destroyed the Japanese 15th Army at Imphal and Kohima. By March 1945, the 14th Army had destroyed Japanese Burma Area Army in central Burma. The same soldiers who had fled in 1942 were crushing the same enemy who had defeated them. The difference was leadership, training, and morale. Slim provided all three. The scale of the achievement becomes clear when examined in detail. The 14th Army numbered approximately 1 million men at peak strength. It operated across a front that stretched from Assam to Arakan, a distance of several hundred miles. It fought continuously from 1942 to 1945 with minimal rest and minimal relief. It suffered constant casualties from disease and combat. It was supplied entirely by air and by roads that engineers built as the Army advanced. It integrated multinational forces seamlessly. It developed and implemented new tactics and doctrine in the middle of active operations. It defeated a determined enemy who had proven capable of defeating larger forces elsewhere. No other British commander in World War II accomplished anything comparable. Alexander commanded in Italy, but fought with overwhelming material superiority and achieved limited results. Montgomery commanded in North Africa and Europe, but operated with massive support and still struggled to maintain momentum. Only Slim took a defeated army, rebuilt it from nothing, and then used it to achieve decisive victories with limited resources in the worst possible conditions. This achievement places him among the greatest operational commanders of the 20th century. The Burma campaign also vindicated Slim's understanding of morale. His emphasis on troop welfare was not sentimentality. It was recognition that soldiers fight better when they trust their commanders and believe their suffering has purpose. The 14th Army fought for 3 years in conditions that would have broken most units. They fought because Slim convinced them they could win and because he treated them with respect and dignity. Morale is not an abstract concept. It is concrete and measurable. High morale reduces desertion rates, increases combat effectiveness, and sustains units through extended operations. Slim understood this instinctively and acted on it consistently. The vindication of air supply doctrine was equally significant. In 1942, conventional wisdom held that armies required continuous landlines of communication. If those lines were cut, the army had to retreat or surrender. Slim rejected this conventional wisdom and proved it wrong. The defensive boxes at Imphal were supplied entirely by air for 3 months. The advance to Meiktila was sustained by air supply over distances that exceeded any previous operation. Air supply eliminated the vulnerability to infiltration that Japanese tactics exploited. This changed the fundamental dynamics of jungle warfare. The Japanese could no longer cut supply lines and force British units to retreat. British units could hold positions indefinitely if supplied from the air. The psychological and operational effects were revolutionary. The integration of armor in Burma demonstrated flexibility and creativity. Conventional wisdom held that tanks were unsuitable for jungle warfare. The terrain was too difficult. The vegetation was too dense. The monsoon made movement impossible. Slim disagreed. He used tanks in Burma because he recognized that firepower and mobility were valuable regardless of terrain. The 255th Tank Brigade proved the concept. Sherman tanks operated effectively in terrain that everyone had declared unsuitable. They provided fire support that was decisive in numerous engagements. They enabled the rapid exploitation toward Meiktila that destroyed Japanese logistics. Slim used the tools he had rather than complaining about the tools he lacked. This pragmatism was typical of his approach. The campaign also demonstrated the limitations of rigid doctrine. Japanese tactics in 1941 and 1942 were highly effective. Infiltration, encirclement, and night attacks defeated British forces repeatedly. But Japanese commanders failed to adapt when British forces changed their tactics. The Japanese continued using infiltration even after British forces learned to hold defensive boxes and be supplied by air. The Japanese continued night attacks even after British forces improved their night fighting capabilities. Japanese doctrine was inflexible. Slim's doctrine emphasized adaptation and initiative. When tactics failed, they were changed. When new opportunities appeared, they were exploited. The 14th Army learned continuously. The Japanese Army did not. This difference determined the outcome. The human cost of the campaign cannot be ignored. Approximately 70,000 British and Commonwealth personnel were killed, wounded, or missing in Burma between 1942 and 1945. Japanese casualties exceeded 100,000 killed. Burmese civilian casualties are difficult to estimate, but were substantial. Cities were bombed. Villages were burned. Populations were displaced. The country was devastated. Liberation came at enormous cost. Slim understood this. He never glorified war. He never romanticized combat. He wrote honestly about the horror and waste. But he also understood that the alternative to fighting was Japanese occupation. The cost of fighting was terrible. The cost of not fighting would have been worse. The post-war fate of Burma added bitter irony to the campaign. Burma achieved independence from Britain in 1948. The country almost immediately descended into civil war. Ethnic insurgencies, communist rebellions, military coups, decades of dictatorship. The democracy that Slim's soldiers fought to defend never materialized. The veterans who returned to Burma after the war found a country that had no place for them. British officials and officers departed. The Burmese who had fought alongside them were left to navigate a chaotic and violent political landscape. Some prospered, many did not. The sacrifices made between 1942 and 1945 did not produce the peaceful and stable Burma that soldiers had hoped for. For the British soldiers who fought there, Burma remained a defining experience. The jungle, the monsoon, the disease, the combat, the shared suffering, the victories against impossible odds. They had been part of the forgotten army. They had endured conditions that troops in Europe could not imagine. They had won battles that received minimal recognition. They had followed a commander who treated them with respect and led them to victory. The experience shaped them. Decades later, veterans of the Burma campaign spoke of Slim with reverence. He was the general who cared, the general who understood, the general who won. The contrast with other British generals is instructive. Montgomery cultivated a public image carefully and insisted on recognition. Alexander was charming and diplomatic and received credit for victories others won. Mountbatten was theatrical and politically connected. Slim was none of these things. He was competent and direct and uninterested in publicity. He focused on his job. He commanded his army. He won his battles. He went home. Recognition came later and from unexpected sources. The soldiers who served under him remembered. Historians who studied the campaign recognized his genius. The British public eventually acknowledged what officials at the time had ignored. The lessons Slim taught remain relevant. Leadership is about earning trust through competence and integrity. Morale is maintained through honest communication and genuine concern for welfare. Victory is achieved through training, planning, and execution, not through speeches and slogans. Adaptation is more important than doctrine. Initiative is more valuable than obedience. Soldiers fight better when they understand the mission and trust their commanders. These principles are timeless. They applied in Burma in 1944. They apply everywhere that soldiers fight. Slim's legacy is preserved in multiple forms. His memoir, Defeat into Victory, remains essential reading for military professionals. His operational concepts are studied at staff colleges. His leadership principles are taught in officer training. The battles he won are commemorated at memorials in Burma and Britain. The soldiers he led left written accounts and oral histories describing what it meant to serve under his command. The historians who study World War II consistently rank him among the greatest commanders. The recognition that was denied him during the war has been granted in full by subsequent generations. The story of William Slim is the story of competence triumphing over neglect. He commanded an army that everyone forgot in a theater that everyone ignored. He received minimal support and faced maximum difficulty. He transformed defeat into victory through leadership, planning, and determination. He won the greatest land victories Britain achieved against Japan. He did this without publicity, without political connections, without powerful patrons. He did it because he was exceptionally good at his job and because he understood soldiers and how to lead them. In the final analysis, Slim demonstrated what one exceptional commander can accomplish with limited resources if given freedom to act. He was not micromanaged by superiors. He was not hamstrung by political interference. He was given a mission and the authority to accomplish it. He succeeded because he understood operational art, logistics, morale, and leadership at a level few commanders achieve. He built an army. He trained that army. He led that army to victory. Then he went home and let others take the credit. That is leadership reduced to its essence. That is why the soldiers called him Uncle Bill. That is why historians call him great. The memorial at Kohima still stands. The words still resonate. When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow. We gave our today. The men who held Kohima Ridge in April 1944 gave everything. The men who fought across Burma from 1942 to 1945 gave everything. They followed Slim. They trusted him. He led them from defeat to victory. He never forgot them. They never forgot him. That is the measure of a commander. That is the legacy of William Slim.